The Bible came to me in a padded envelope, sent by a woman named Catherine Hartley, who lived in Seattle. Her note was brief. This belonged to my great-great-grandfather. There's a wedding photograph inside that doesn't match the family records. I thought you might be able to help explain it. I specialize in genealogical mysteries, helping families untangle contradictions in their histories. Usually it's simple errors, dates copied incorrectly, middle names confused, siblings with similar names mixed up. But sometimes the mysteries go deeper, revealing secrets that families buried deliberately. The Bible was beautiful, leather-bound, gold embossed, the kind of family heirloom that had been carefully preserved through generations. Inside the front cover was a family register in faded ink. Edward James Hartley, born March 15, 1859, Savannah, Georgia. Married, Margaret Louise Crawford, November 7, 1884. Children: Catherine, born 1885. Edward Jr., born 1887. Thomas, born 1889. Standard family records. But tucked between the pages of the Book of Ruth was a photograph, a formal wedding portrait showing a couple posed in an elegant studio setting. The backdrop featured painted archways and stairs, suggesting a grand house. The groom wore a dark suit and held a hat. The bride wore an elaborate white dress with lace detailing and held a cascading bouquet. Her hair was styled high with decorative flowers. On the back of the photograph, in the same hand as the Bible's family register, Edward and his bride, November 7, 1884. The date matched. November 7, 1884. Edward James Hartley's wedding day. But when I looked at the photograph more carefully, I noticed something odd. At the bottom edge of the mounting board, in different, more modern handwriting, someone had written, "This is not Margaret." I scanned the photograph at high resolution and began my research. Finding information about Edward Hartley was straightforward. Census records, city directories, newspaper mentions. He'd been a successful merchant in Savannah, owner of a dry goods store. He'd married Margaret Crawford in November 1884, and they'd had 3 children. He died in 1921 at age 62. A conventional life by all appearances. Margaret Crawford Hartley had lived until 1936. Her obituary described her as a devoted wife and mother, active in the First Presbyterian Church, survived by her children and 9 grandchildren. I found a photograph of Margaret from around 1910, published in a church newsletter. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with a strong jaw and serious expression. I compared it to the bride in the wedding photograph, accounting for age and photographic quality. They were not the same woman. The bone structure was different. The nose, the shape of the face, the spacing of the eyes. None of it matched. The woman in the wedding photograph was not Margaret Crawford. So who was she? And why was her photograph in Edward Hartley's family Bible, dated the same day he married Margaret? I contacted Catherine Hartley and explained what I'd found. The bride in the photograph isn't Margaret Crawford. Do you know of any other woman Edward might have been involved with? Her response came quickly. No. The family always said Edward and Margaret had a happy marriage. But my grandmother, Edward's granddaughter, used to say there was something strange about their wedding. She said Margaret never liked to talk about it, that she got upset if anyone mentioned the wedding day. We always thought it was just Victorian propriety or something. I dug deeper into the Savannah records from 1884. Marriage licenses were public records, so I started there. Edward James Hartley had indeed obtained a marriage license on November 5th, 1884. The bride's name, Margaret Louise Crawford. But when I found the marriage registry at the First Presbyterian Church, something caught my attention. The entry was dated November 7th, 1884, but it looked different from the others on the page. The ink was darker, the handwriting slightly different, as though the entry had been made later and inserted into the correct chronological position. I kept searching. In the Savannah Morning News from November 8, 1884, I found a brief announcement. Married. On November 7th, at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, Mr. Edward Hartley to Miss Margaret Crawford. A small private ceremony, attended by family only. A small private ceremony. That was unusual for a prominent merchant's wedding. Most society weddings in that era were large affairs, extensively covered in the newspapers. Then I found something that made my pulse quicken. In the same newspaper, 3 pages later in the obituary section, died. November 7th, Miss Alice Thornton, aged 23, daughter of the late Dr. Robert Thornton. Death occurred suddenly. Funeral services will be held Monday at the family home. Friends are respectfully invited. November 7th, 1884. The same day as Edward Hartley's wedding. A young woman, aged 23, died suddenly. No cause of death given. I searched for more information about Alice Thornton. She'd been the daughter of a prominent physician who had died several years earlier. She lived with her mother in a house on Bull Street, one of Savannah's best addresses. She was, by all accounts, well educated and accomplished. And then I found a society column from September 1884, 2 months before Edward's wedding. It is rumoured that an engagement will soon be announced between Mr. Edward Hartley, the enterprising merchant, and Miss Alice Thornton, whose late father was so respected in our community. The match would be most suitable. Edward Hartley had been courting Alice Thornton, but he'd married Margaret Crawford, and Alice had died on the wedding day. I located a photograph of Alice Thornton in a Savannah Society journal from 1883. She'd been photographed at a charity event, one of several young women in a group portrait. I enhanced the image, extracted her face, and compared it to the bride in the wedding photograph. It was a match. The bone structure, the distinctive nose, the shape of the face, identical. The bride in Edward Hartley's wedding photograph was Alice Thornton, not Margaret Crawford. But that was impossible. Edward had married Margaret on November 7th, 1884. The church records confirmed it. The newspaper announcement confirmed it. Alice Thornton had died that same day. Unless the photograph had been taken before November 7th. Unless it showed a wedding that was supposed to happen, but didn't. I examined the photograph more carefully. The studio setting was elaborate, clearly a professional photographer's work.
I could make out a photographer's mark embossed on the mounting board. J.R. Morrison, Fine Portraiture, Savannah. I searched for information about J.R. Morrison and found his studio had operated from 1880 to 1892. But more importantly, I found something in his advertisement from the Savannah Morning News, October 1884. J.R. Morrison respectfully announces special rates for bridal portraits through November. Couples may book their sessions in advance to ensure the finest quality for this momentous occasion. Book their sessions in advance. Wedding photographs taken before the actual wedding day. It was starting to make sense. Edward and Alice had been engaged. They'd gone to Morrison's studio to have their wedding portrait made, probably in October, in advance of their planned November wedding. But something had happened between the photograph and the ceremony. Something that resulted in Alice's death and Edward's sudden marriage to Margaret Crawford instead. I found more clues in the Thornton family papers, which had been donated to the Georgia Historical Society. Among Alice's correspondence was a letter dated October 20th, 1884,
Written to a friend in Charleston. Edward and I had our photograph made yesterday at Morrison's studio. We looked quite grand, I must say. The photographer said it was one of his finest works. Edward was nervous. He dislikes being photographed. But I convinced him it was important to have a record of this happy time. The wedding is set for November 7th. I can hardly believe it's real. October 20th. The photograph had been taken more than 2 weeks before Alice's death. I kept reading through Alice's papers. The letters from late October were cheerful, full of wedding preparations. But then I found something disturbing. A letter dated November 5th, just 2 days before the wedding. I'm writing this quickly, as I have little time. Edward came to see me today and said we must postpone the wedding. He would not give me a clear reason, only that circumstances have changed, and it would be imprudent to proceed. I am devastated beyond words. Mother is urging me to be reasonable, but I cannot understand what has changed. We were so happy. I cannot imagine my life without him. November 5th. 2 days before what should have been her wedding day. Edward had called off the engagement. And 2 days later, Alice Thornton was dead. I found one more document in the Thornton papers. A sealed letter addressed to Edward Hartley, never sent. It was dated November 7th, 1884, written in an increasingly shaky hand. Edward, I cannot bear this. You have abandoned me without explanation, and I am expected to simply accept it and move forward with my life. But I cannot. I will not. You promised me everything, and now you deny me even the courtesy of honesty. I had such hopes for our life together. I saw it so clearly, could picture it down to the smallest detail. And now it is all destroyed. I wonder if you will think of me in the years to come. I wonder if you will remember the photograph we had made. How happy we were that day. I hope you will. I hope it haunts you. I hope every time you look at that image, you will remember what you did. The letter ended there, unsigned. Alice Thornton had died November 7th, 1884. The coroner's report which I found in the city records, listed the cause of death as heart failure. But there was a notation in the margin, in different handwriting. Laudanum bottle found empty beside bed. Suspected excess. Laudanum. Opium dissolved in alcohol. Commonly used as medicine in the Victorian era. Easy to overdose on. Impossible to determine if the overdose was accidental or intentional. Alice Thornton had died of a laudanum overdose. On the day that should have been her wedding, hours after writing a bitter letter to the man who'd broken their engagement, the same day Edward Hartley married someone else. I pieced together the rest from scattered records. Edward had become engaged to Alice Thornton in the summer of 1884. They'd had their wedding portrait made in October. But then something had happened. Some scandal, or financial reversal, or family pressure, that led Edward to break the engagement on November 5th. 2 days later, Alice was dead, and Edward was hastily married to Margaret Crawford in a small private ceremony. I found one more piece of the puzzle, in a letter from Margaret Crawford to her sister, dated 1895, 11 years after the wedding. The letter had been preserved in a family collection at the Georgia Historical Society. Edward still keeps that photograph. I've asked him many times to dispose of it, but he will not. He says he owes her that much, to remember her. I try to be understanding. I know their engagement was broken through no fault of his. Her family's financial situation made it impossible, and his business associates made it clear he must reconsider. But it is difficult to live with a ghost. Sometimes I see him looking at that photograph with such sadness, and I wonder if he will ever truly be mine, or if part of him will always belong to the woman in that picture. The financial situation. That was what had ended the engagement. Alice's family had lost money, probably in some business reversal, and Edward, or perhaps his business partners, had decided the match was no longer suitable. He'd broken the engagement, and Alice, devastated and seeing no future, had taken her own life. But Edward had kept the wedding photograph, the portrait of a wedding that never happened, with a bride who died rather than live without him. He'd kept it in his family Bible for the rest of his life, despite Margaret's objections. And someone, at some point, probably Margaret herself, had written on the mounting board, "This is not Margaret." A claim to her place in the family. An insistence that she was the real wife, not the woman in the photograph. But the Bible told a different story. The photograph, tucked in the Book of Ruth, the story of a woman who married into a family not her own, who was accepted despite being an outsider. Was that how Margaret saw herself? An outsider, always competing with the memory of the woman Edward had truly loved. I compiled all my findings and sent them to Catherine Hartley. Her response came a week later. "Thank you for solving this mystery. It explains so much about the family stories I grew up with. My grandmother used to say that her grandfather, Edward, was a melancholy man, that there was a sadness in him that never went away. And she said her grandmother, Margaret, was a very practical, sometimes bitter woman. She said Margaret once told her, 'I gave your grandfather a good life, but I could never give him happiness. That belonged to someone else.' I thought about that for a long time. Margaret had married Edward, knowing, probably, that she was his second choice. That he'd broken his engagement to Alice for practical reasons, not because he stopped loving her. And then Alice had died, cementing herself forever in Edward's memory as the lost love, the woman who could have been. The bride in the wedding photograph that showed a marriage that never was. Margaret had raised his children, managed his household, been his companion for more than 30 years. But she'd lived in the shadow of that photograph. The image of Edward and Alice dressed for a wedding that never happened, frozen forever in that moment of anticipated happiness. The photograph now sits in Catherine Hartley's home in Seattle. She's had it properly framed and displayed, along with the documentation I provided explaining its history. The image shows Edward James Hartley and Alice Thornton, photographed October 20th, 1884, in anticipation of their November 7th wedding. The wedding never took place. Alice died November 7th, and Edward married Margaret Crawford that same day. Catherine told me she finds the photograph both beautiful and heartbreaking. "They look so happy," she said. "So hopeful. They had no idea what was coming." I think about that sometimes. The way photographs capture moments we think represent the future, but which turn out to be lies. Edward and Alice, posed as bride and groom, imagining a life together that would never materialize. The photograph preserved their happiness, but it was happiness built on false assumptions. Within 2 weeks of that photograph being taken, their engagement would be broken, Alice would be dead, and Edward would be married to someone else. The photograph was supposed to document a beginning. Instead, it documented an ending, a future that never arrived, a bride who never was. Edward kept it his entire life, hidden in his Bible, a secret memorial to the woman he'd loved and abandoned, the woman who'd died on what should have been their wedding day. He looked at it, Margaret said, with sadness, with remembrance, perhaps with guilt. And Margaret lived with that ghost for more than 30 years. The woman in the photograph who wasn't her, who would never be her, but who had somehow claimed a permanent place in her husband's heart. The bride in the picture wasn't the woman Edward married, but perhaps, in the ways that mattered most to him, she was the woman he wanted to marry. The woman he should have married. The woman whose loss he mourned for the rest of his life. The photograph remains, beautiful and false, showing a wedding that never happened, preserving a happiness that lasted only until the shutter closed and reality returned. Edward and Alice, forever bride and groom, forever standing in that elaborate studio with its painted archways and promise of a grand future. Forever married in the photograph, if nowhere else. Forever together, in that one frozen moment, even as life pulled them apart, and death made the separation permanent. The bride in the picture wasn't the woman he married, but she was, perhaps, the woman he loved. And the photograph, hidden in a Bible for more than a century, kept that love preserved, secret, sacred. A wedding that never was. A marriage that existed only in silver and paper, and the guilty, grieving heart of a man who looked at that image and remembered what might have been. What should have been. What was. For one brief shutter click. In October 1884. Before everything went wrong.